على العدو ومن خلف العدو.
The enemy and those who are behind the enemy must await our inevitable response. There is no discussion or argument about this, and the days and nights and the battlefield will prove it.
الأيام والليالي والميدان.
This fiery warning came from Hezbollah chief Hassan Nasrallah on August 18th in a televised speech during the funeral ceremony for Fuad Shukr. Shukr was killed by an Israeli airstrike that hit the Lebanese capital of Beirut on July 30th. One day later, Hamas chief Ismail Haniyeh was assassinated in the Iranian capital of Tehran. No one has the right to doubt the legal right of the Islamic Republic of Iran to punish the aggressor and create deterrence against a usurping, aggressor regime. Following the assassination, on August 5th, Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman Nasser Kanani gave an equally fiery warning. In a perceived retort to both Iran and Hezbollah, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said on August 21st, "I am here at the Air Force Base to closely monitor our preparations against both near and distant threats. We are ready for any scenario, both in defense and offense." Tensions were high before the killing of Shukr and Haniyeh. Today the dial is creeping into the danger zone, but does this mean that a wider regional war is inevitable? This week, how real is the risk? Who is pushing for war? Who is trying to pull the region back? And what can be done to avoid devastation? Welcome back to the New Arab Voice. The New Arab Voice podcast has been off for a few months. If you've been keeping up with the news from the region, then you'll likely know that the situation has not improved. At the time of our last episode, around the end of April, at least 34,356 people were known to have been killed in Gaza, and over 77,000 people had been injured. Today, the number of killed has reached 40,233. Over 10,000 are children. Furthermore, around 93,000 Palestinians have been injured. It's a tragic truth that since the end of April, nothing much has changed in Gaza. It's a continuation of the same, but the same is still horrifying to behold. Massacres are an almost daily occurrence. Families are torn apart, civilians are forced to flee their homes to areas designated as safe zones, where they are still targeted. Aid deliveries fall vastly short of what is needed. Normally treatable diseases are spreading amongst the population, and talks to end the violence splutter and fail. The daily existence for people in Gaza is a waking nightmare. Some of the biggest developments have been beyond the borders of Palestine and Israel. Probably most notably, the killing of Hezbollah commander Fuad Shukr and Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh. These assassinations and an anticipated response by Iran and Hezbollah that targets Israel has, once again, ratcheted up tensions in the region.
I would say the threat of that happening has increased tremendously, significantly, even though both parties, namely Iran and Hezbollah, have their own internal issues.
This is Khaled Jashan, Executive Director of the Arab Center, Washington, D.C.
There is no total consensus or unity in terms of how to conduct this war, in terms of the next steps on the part of any side at all.
The assassination of Hezbollah commander Shukr could be described as an escalation, but not too surprising. After all, since the start of the war, Israel has conducted a number of other airstrikes that have targeted both Hamas and Hezbollah leaders in both southern Lebanon and southern Beirut. The assassination of Haniyeh was a lot more shocking, for two main reasons. Firstly, the fact that it was Haniyeh himself. He was the leader of Hamas, one of the group's most prominent figures and a central voice in negotiations. Israel has always said that they would target the leadership, but it doesn't make it any less of a bold move. Secondly, the location. Haniyeh was killed in Tehran. He was visiting the Iranian capital to attend the inauguration of the new Iranian president, Masoud Pezeshkian. Such a strike in the heart of Iran was viewed by the Iranians as an intense provocation by Israel. With these two assassinations, for many observers, the question was not if Iran and Hezbollah would retaliate, but when.
There are elements that basically feel that not retaliating immediately or within reasonable time, let's put it, is going to undermine the credibility of Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is already under constraint anyway because of the collapse of the state and all kinds of other internal difficulties in Lebanon. But also it is related also to the kind of bilateral relationship between Iran and Hezbollah, whether Hezbollah can continue to maintain a good working relationship with Iran, which it has to survive, and yet maintain its own credibility from an Arab and purely Lebanese perspective. That's another story, because criticism has increased since then. The series of assassination, there are several hundred people that have been killed from Hezbollah, including several top leaders, not just one. And Hezbollah has not fully retaliated. It has retaliated within the context of the traditional tit-for-tat, if you will, understanding between Hezbollah and Israel.
On the other side, there have been growing fears that a retaliation will be the catalyst needed for Israel to launch an attack against Iran and also an invasion of Lebanon. These are not completely unfounded fears. There are those in Israel who do want a war, but they don't all want the same type of war.
First, you have the camp of those looking to prolong the war situation in Gaza.
This is Dr. Nimrod Goran, Senior Fellow for Israeli Affairs at the Middle East Institute.
Even if it's a lower intensity one compared to what we've seen some months ago. The second is those who advocate for increased military action in Lebanon against Hezbollah to try and somehow resolve the situation along the Israel-Lebanon border. And the third is the option of going full-fledged regional war to try and dismantle the Iran-led axis.
Broadly speaking, those seeking war fall into one of these three categories: a continuation of the war in Gaza, attacking Hezbollah in Lebanon, or taking the fight directly to Iran and its axis across the region. With its ongoing war in Gaza and the threats from beyond its borders, Israel is at a crucial juncture, and yet seems unable to agree on a unified way forward.
In terms of what's happening in Gaza, I think there's a gap between what the Prime Minister is doing and where the Israeli public and security establishment is, because over the last few months you saw an increase in the support of Israelis in the option of a deal, a ceasefire and a hostage release deal between Israel and Hamas, the deal that currently the Americans, the Egyptians, the Qataris are trying to mediate for several months. The support in that is going up, even in return for an end of war, which Netanyahu does not want to see.
Reticence on the part of Netanyahu is driven by both ideology and his desire to survive politically. When an outcome for the war is reached, whatever that may be, he and his government will face serious questions about the failings on October 7th, in addition to the corruption charges that have hung over him since before the war.
On the second aspect of Lebanon, I think the support for increased military action there is causing political divides, because the assessment is that the situation that is now within the Israeli north, that communities have been evacuated for a long time, the security situation doesn't move forward. There is a war of attrition basically between Israel and Hezbollah, and people are back at what could solve that. And some people also on the center, also on the left, are calling for military action that is geared specifically towards Hezbollah.
Such a move against Hezbollah could be justified by many in Israel, who would see it as an effort to secure their northern border, from which thousands have fled due to Hezbollah rocket fire.
On the regional level, I think there are very few Israelis who would like Israel now to enter this adventure of going all out against all the proxies of Iran and Iran itself. I don't think there's a mindset supporting of that. Perhaps only on the Israeli far right that thinks that only military force can basically serve Israel's problems.
A direct move against Iran would be a drastic move, and the least likely. Unhelpfully, those calling for such an action can be very loud and as a result be handed more media coverage than their ideas warrant. A move against Hezbollah does have more support, and oddly is supported by some who also want the war in Gaza to end.
For example, Benny Gantz, a centrist political leader, or even Yair Golan, who is now leading the new left-wing party, a merger of what was Labour and Meretz, who are calling for enhanced action against Hezbollah. They also support a ceasefire with Hamas, and their assessment is that if there will be a ceasefire with Hamas in Gaza, that by definition will lead to the diffusion of tensions with Hezbollah as the next step. So their preference is for diplomacy, but they say if the situation continues, the Israeli military may have no other choice than to act because that's the responsibility of the state to its leader.
It's a stance that's probably best described as saber-rattling. It's valid diplomacy when it works, but potentially disastrous if it doesn't. Additionally, being strong in the face of threats from the north and also falling in line with the general mood of the country vis-à-vis the war in Gaza could help the likes of Gantz and Gallant in any potential upcoming elections.
And all the others that support a deal with hostage release and ceasefire with Hamas, that is 63% of the Israeli public, according to a poll that was aired just a few days ago on TV, compared to only 12% of the Israeli public that opposes the ceasefire deal. That portion of 63% of the Israelis basically say by supporting a ceasefire that they do not want the war to continue. So you see it vis-a-vis like the polls, you see it through actions on the streets, people are protesting, going to showcase their support for ending the war. You see security officials stepping up and talking to the media. You even see negotiators from Israeli team leaking to the press criticism on how things are managed within the negotiation process. So there is kind of a significant part and voice of our society that is voicing their concerns and their position through different channels.
That poll by the Israeli news station Channel 12 also reported that 44% of Netanyahu's voters support the deal.
Sense that there is no real strategy guiding what Israel does. And IDF military leaders said it several times that they find it difficult to leverage the achievements that Israel achieves on the battleground into diplomatic gains or a new reality, because it's not clear where the governments want to see things going. There was also pressures on Netanyahu to present a day after plan. Eventually he did so, but that was the plan that was so far away from what the international community and many in Israel want to see that it doesn't seem to be very relevant. So the total victory is a political slogan, and it is used for his domestic electoral base as part of Netanyahu's effort to somehow bounce back from the very poor approval rating that he has in Israel since October 7.
While Israel may not have a guiding strategy, is the same true for their adversaries? Are Iran and Hezbollah forming unified plans of attack? Khalil Jashanigan.
I would say the people on the fringe geographically are probably tend to be more militant and more supported, like the Houthis, definitely. The Shia militias in Iraq, definitely. Even some elements within Hezbollah, which is not totally homogeneous, as we all know, are more gung-ho, quote unquote, than others. It is not a uniform reaction. Iran is divided also. It does in different directions itself, and that impacts both its willingness and its ability and its plans to retaliate.
They're not forming unified plans of attack. But it doesn't mean that there aren't those who want to. Just like Israel, there are elements who are seeking war. But as Khalil says, they tend to be more on the fringes. Iran and Hezbollah are both pretty keen on mildly bombastic speeches with plenty of references to destruction and complete annihilation and terrible furies. But throughout the conflict, when push comes to shove, the response is generally more muted than that. Often a barrage of rockets, which are often shot down and cause minimal damage, although that's not always the case, and they have caused a number of casualties. The war being waged in Gaza and the wider Palestinian liberation movement is of great concern to both Hezbollah and Iran. But that does not mean that they are necessarily willing to tool up and go to war.
These organizations, in analyzing over the years the behavior of what is called sometimes as state-like organizations, I mean, they're not states, but they're aspiring in a way to control states or to be states in the future. It depends who you're talking about. And the same thing with Iran itself as a state under siege, aspiring to basically remove that siege or end that siege. So they basically, tend to base their decisions on the part of their interests. So there is a state-like behavior, in other words. And states like to engage in self-preservation as they formulate policy. No state is in the business of committing collective suicide. So I see that behavior in that the mainstream of these organizations or states in some respect like Iran, they are also concerned about self-preservation.
A war between Israel and an Iranian axis, or even just Hezbollah on their own, would be devastating for all sides, but maybe particularly for Lebanon. Even if Hezbollah was able to repulse an Israeli invasion, it's not unforeseeable that parts of the country would be laid waste to. See Gaza for recent examples of Israeli battle tactics. Avoiding this is a very good reason not to engage.
They're all using the same rationale. Do you want to self-destruct, or do you want to get out of the current predicament and achieve some form of normalcy in the future? So that's the argument they have made with Hezbollah, the argument they've made, including the U.S. Basically argument with the Lebanese parties talking directly or indirectly to Hezbollah. Do you want to maintain your political stature in Lebanon or not? So it's a somewhat of a convincing argument, and it has worked in the past. Whether it will continue to work indefinitely remains to be seen.
There could be a war, and blindly stumbling into a war is easily done. But there is no strong desire among the majority of the players to start a war. So, if not war, then peace? Dr. Nimrod Goran again.
First, the effort to reach a ceasefire is something that must continue. And we see that continuing over a long time. We see a lot of political and diplomatic investment, not only by the Americans, but by other countries as well. We also see European countries involved in what's happening with Lebanon, like France, that is investing in trying to find modalities in coordination with the Americans to cool things down over there. So continuing to diffuse tensions to reach a ceasefire, that's one aspect.
This is a ceasefire in Gaza, not directly with Hezbollah or Iran. The thinking is that if you can end the fighting in Gaza, regional tensions will decrease.
The second aspect is about partnership with those in Israel that want to see a change in Israel and want to see a better, peaceful future for the region, because there's a lot of disengagement now in the international community from Israelis. And I think those in Israel that push for change need to see that they have the partnership, the helping hand from the international allies. So that's the second point.
Driven by ideology and a desire for political survival, Netanyahu is unwilling to move forward on a lasting ceasefire. But there are those in Israel who would.
And the third point is this forward-looking effort to really present a vision for the region that is different than what we see today, to somehow inject some positive thinking into the Israeli mindset, because Israelis will go to the polls probably next year. And they need to see a compelling vision that can convince them to vote for a new leadership. A year ago, the international community thought about presenting an incentive package for peace, 2 Israelis, 2 Palestinians. I think if this exercise is followed through, it could have an impact on shaping the domestic discourse, and through that, contributing to a different leadership, to a different policy in the region.
A lasting and sustainable ceasefire in Gaza seems like the place to start. But given the enormity of the destruction and the intense loss of life, would Hezbollah and Iran be able to step back? Has this confrontation with Israel moved past the war in Gaza?
I would venture to say that if I understand the logic, both in Tehran and in southern Lebanon, that both would welcome a ceasefire-hostage exchange agreement in Gaza. Why? Because not only because of their support to Hamas or lack of support, but because it gives them an exit ramp from the current predicament they're facing. Hezbollah and Iran then will be able to argue that we haven't retaliated, and they can shut up their critics, domestic or regional or international, and say, listen, you don't understand. We did this for a purpose. The purpose here is not just to fight. The purpose is to achieve something for the Palestinians. And look what happened. And frankly, our pressure did help produce that agreement. So they will use it to their advantage. I have no doubts about that, and will use it to kind of justify the fact that they have not retaliated as they declared themselves. So they put themselves in a way in the corner, and that type of agreement might give them the exit ramp out of that corner.
We've had attempts at a ceasefire deal for Gaza. Hamas proposed ceasefire deals, which Israel rejected. Israel has proposed ceasefire deals, which Hamas have rejected. The most recent efforts came earlier this week with something called a bridging proposal. On August 20th, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken met with Netanyahu. Following the meeting, he spoke with reporters.
In a very constructive meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu today, he confirmed to me that Israel accepts the bridging proposal, that he supports it. It's now incumbent on Hamas to do the same.
I think basically the bridging proposal talks about the ceasefire deal because it's a bridging about the issue that was still in dispute following the plan that Biden spelled out in May, plus all kind of changes in the ground, especially around the Philadelphia corridor along the border between Gaza and Egypt.
Prior to the start of the war, during the long siege of Gaza, the border between the Strip and Egypt, also known as the Philadelphia corridor, was the only reliable entry and exit point.
So Netanyahu has already stated, even in his visit to Washington, that he accepts the plan that Biden spelled out. So in terms of how it's viewed from Washington, he's basically playing along with what the Americans want him to do. In terms of the discourse in Israel, again, there is this criticism about him saying yes, but putting all kind of additional conditions to stall the process. So I think that's the tactics that he's using already now. It's about playing for time. It's about playing along with the Americans, but making sure that whatever he wants to see going with this deal will not be crossed. And I think eventually Netanyahu could maybe agree to the first phase of the deal for the 6-week ceasefire, the humanitarian release of hostages. But if there will be insistence on a full Israeli withdrawal from the entire Gaza Strip and on a specific commitment to an end of war, I think that goes beyond his current interest.
Goes beyond his current interest. This is a serious problem, which has plagued ceasefire talks since the start. Netanyahu does not want the war to end. Khalil Shashan is also not feeling optimistic.
I had a feeling from what he said yesterday, having met with administration officials and having observed their behavior for the past 10 months very carefully, I would say that his choice of words did not give me assurance that he or his staff are being very, let's say, hopeful about their bridging gaps. I'm reading between the lines.
For the Democrats in the US, making this work would be beneficial for their re-election efforts. But additionally, neither Harris nor Trump want to enter the White House in January with a conflict hanging over them.
We've seen bridging gaps before. This is not the first attempt at bridging the gaps between the parties. We have 10 months of experience in that. Over the past 7 months, I would say, or during the first 7 months of the conflict, I would say the attempt to bridge gaps were just useless. They were futile because at the time, the president himself personally and the administration in general took a very biased position, siding with Israel. And their main objective was, declared or undeclared, was to give Israel plenty of time to finish the job, quote unquote. Now Israel has failed to finish the job, and it doesn't look like it is going to finish the job. The US acknowledges it. People at the highest level in the administration admitted that that's it. Israel has no other useful purpose to continue this war, and it has to stop. And the same thing with Israel itself. I mean, there are senior people in Israel, particularly in the security apparatuses and in the military, that are saying the declared objective of eliminating militarily and politically Hamas as an idea is unachievable. So we might as well stop and find a way to reach an agreement. So things have changed.
The killing of Shukr and Haniyeh have increased tensions and pushed the region closer to a war which no one really wants. With the announcement of further talks, both Iran and Hezbollah have the perfect excuse to hold off on any retaliation for now. On both sides exist those who want to see the war end and some sense of stability to return. Within these societies, these are the voices that have to be the loudest and most listened to, and not those on the fringes calling for increased violence. Final words to Dr. Nimrod Goran.
But I think there's a real chance here that things could get out of control, because especially if Hezbollah goes and attacks and fires rockets or whatever they do to big cities, Haifa, Tel Aviv, Israel will be reacting to that, I think, in a harsh way. And then again, as long as this prolongs and as long as the solution is not found quickly, this could turn into a problem that is not playing into anyone's favor, not in the region, not in the broader international community.
This episode of The New Arab Voice was written and produced by me, Hugo Goodridge. Our theme music was by Omar El-Phil. We'll be back with a new episode of The New Arab Voice shortly. Until then, you can find all our previous episodes on all major podcast platforms. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts, and be notified for when a new episode drops. You can find links in the show notes. You can also check out our Instagram page and Twitter account, both at TNA Podcasts, for additional content. And if you like, you can email us, podcast@newarab.com. That's podcast@newarab.com. If you've got time, you can rate and review, which helps us spread the word. Don't forget to follow The New Arab on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram for all the latest news, analysis and opinion from the region